Hello and welcome to Introduction to Psychology, Chapter 9, Lifespan Development. What a chunk of material to put into one chapter. I teach a whole class in developmental psych and it's still not enough time to cover all this stuff. So essentially we're looking at almost any aspect of psychology. We're adding the factor of time. So we could talk about memory. And we can talk about how memory changes over time. We can talk about sensation, how it changes over time. Learning, changing over time. Emotional expression, changing over time. We're always adding that time piece or age, or adding the age at which something happens. Now, to be able to encompass that, we recognize that the field of lifespan development is also multidisciplinary. We draw in from all kinds of fields, including genetics, medicine, history, sociology, psychology, of course, psychiatry, economics, business, ecology, education, biology, and the list goes on and on. This is bringing all of these things in so that we can have an understanding about individuals in context and how their relationship with those different areas of their life changes them over time. Now, that question of time, when we approach a psychological question, let's say that question is, how does divorce affect the kids? Now, we ask ourselves, how does divorce affect the kids? And we might be able to come up with, an answer. My parents got divorced, so I could give from my perspective, how it affected the kids and whatever experience you might have. Or certainly we can think about that. But I want to say that when we're looking at lifespan development, and truly the best answer to that question is to ask one more question, and that is, how old are the kids? Because if divorce happens, that's one thing. When it happens, tells us more precisely how it will affect the kids. So when we understand the normal pathways of somebody's normative development, as we see changes occurring over time, if something comes along like a divorce, well, how old are they and what's going on during that period of time? Because that's the stuff that might get impacted. So we'll ask ourselves questions like this one. We say, how does divorce affect the kids? Well, depends on what age they are. So you have this graphic from 0 to 80 years old. What if the divorce happened right here at 1 year old? What's going on at 1 year old? Those are the things that would be disrupted. Would there be, we might even consider that at this very, very young age, they won't become aware of the fact they're living in a different kind of home. They might grow up the rest of their life in a single parent home and they would not have known anything else. So it might be better at that age, depending on the outcomes, because it's certainly, remember, all these other things, economics comes in. What if the person taking care of the child moves from having a comfortable lifestyle to not having a comfortable lifestyle, back at work, the child's in daycare, those kinds of factors that start to come in when we look at the individual picture. But as far as the child is concerned, what's going on at 1 that might get disrupted by the fact that their parents are getting divorced? Now, we could also look at what if it happens when they're 16? What's going on with the typical 16-year-old, in terms of peers, in terms of planning for their life, in terms of the importance of school, career planning, all of it, being deviant maybe, a little bit, experimenting with different lifestyles, the pressure of being in school, those kind of things come up. What about a 4-year-old? It's a person about to enter into those first social interactions in kindergarten. Those kind of things. What if the person is 32 years old? And really, this is a funny chapter, because there's a funny component, because I was in class one time and I asked, how does divorce affect the kids? And the one person raised their hand and said, the kids throw a party And I'd never heard that response before, but she relayed this idea that her and her brothers had put together a party for both of their parents when they went through the divorce. They stayed together throughout their childhood, and the kids knew they couldn't stand each other, and they just, toughed it out till the kids were gone. So by the time they got a divorce, the kids were old enough to recognize they wanted happiness for both of their parents, knew their parents would not achieve that with their partners, and had two separate parties, one for dad, one for mom. About time you guys get that done. So you could see a very, very different effect. At the same time, I want to relate that when people are going through a divorce, you have the age of the kid. If there's more than one kid, it's different effects, but there's also the age of the parents. How old are the parents when things get disrupted in terms of their plan? You can see this could be, a couple that's 30 years old that has a 4-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 16-year-old. There's some dynamics there that can be pretty wacky simply because there's so many developmental clocks happening at the same time. And that brings me, segue into the idea of developmental clocks. Like clocks, as we know, pace time. They tell us as time is passing. Now, not to be undone by time itself, psychology has 4 developmental clocks. You're aware of one of them, and that's the biological clock. You've probably heard that, and that's the biological genetic timetable of maturation that we have in our bodies, but there are more. So here we have our biological clock, the timetable of when I go through puberty, when I got my first gray hair. It's not because of kids, that's all genetic. But then there's the psychological clock. This timetable focuses on what we might refer to as emotional maturity. It might also focus on the cognitive skills such as memory, processing, learning skills, all of those, and how those change over time. So that's a different clock. Now another clock is the social clock. Now the social clock is not how adept we become at social interaction. What it has to do is with society's expectations for our behavior at certain ages. So let's say I'm 75 and I'm in a bar trying to pick up 20-year-olds. Maybe some of you just started laughing. That's pretty good. The laughter would be like, well, I'm not expecting to see a 75-year-old. Nobody is expecting to see a 75-year-old out there trying to pick up 20-somethings. What would you expect? Just for a moment, consider in your own cultural upbringing. I say, picture a 70-year-old man. What are they doing? I can almost guarantee they're not rock climbing. That's not what popped in your head, even though there are many 75-year-old men that go rock climbing. You might have had a very stereotypical image as to what 75 looks like, or an image from somebody who maybe is a little outside the norm. Well, my grandfather's the rock climber, or he's still piloting jets, kind of thing, that sort of thing. Or running for president, look at the age of those guys. So the social clock is about what should you be doing at that. And certainly we can see sort of some age norms related to what adulthood means, although American society is pretty off the wall on that. Lots of mixed messages right from 16, well, let's go to 13, with some of the religions like the Catholic Church and Judaism have celebrations when a kid turns 13 and they're adults within the church. And then there's the age of 16, things happen. Age 17, things happen. Age 18, things happen. Age 21, things happen. And age 26, and I say 26, sometimes 25 and 26 is when you see certain people will fall off the benefits of their parents, so they're then forced in that one more level of independence and adulthood and all that stuff. And then there's all the rites of passage, the various graduations, or the first time you've had sex, or the first when you get married, or when you have a kid, or when you smoked your first cigarette. All these are sort of passageways to where is adulthood, That alone is like really interesting. What does that look like? But we certainly clearly know when someone has not launched yet. We might think about somebody who they're 35, still living at home, eating at the table, and mom's doing their laundry. And we're like, something's wrong with this picture, unless the social clock is modified by disability. If we then find out that that individual who's 35 years old, living at home, and his mom does his laundry, actually has a very severe disability, we're like, oh, okay, that resets the clock. So that one is kind of mobile. The biological clock, psychological clock, those sort of have fixed components in them based on our genetics. The psychological clock, of course, that very deep interaction with society, with the biological clock as well. But the social clock is culture. That's really a lot about what that one is. Now, the last clock is the historical clock. And this is the one that places you at a time in history. It's when you're born. I was born in 1965. It's the cusp year between the baby boomers and Gen X. So that I have characteristics actually of my personality that match baby boomers and Gen X. I'm much more Gen X than baby boomer. But kind of when I was born tells me kind of the things I've seen, the societal changes that I've seen, the norms of my day and all this. And that separates me into a generation and makes me different in many ways than the students I teach. Might be millennials, they might be Gen Y, individuals that are born in 2020. And so those there's a generation gap that exists there, and both parties benefit by understanding where the other person is coming from in terms of their world experience. So when we are describing ourselves, when we're taking a snapshot at any given time, we can actually talk about ourselves in this way. Where am I in terms of my biological clock? Where am I in terms of my psychological clock? Where am I in terms of my social clock? And where am I in terms of my historical clock? Now, we've all seen the spy movies where individuals are all huddled together and they all look at their watches and they synchronize their watches so everybody's on the same time period. This does not happen with the developmental clock. Sometimes our biological clock is out of sync with our psychological clock. Sometimes our social clock is out of sync with the others. Our historical clock can leave us stuck in a particular mentality that doesn't allow us to look. Our historical clock can also leave us without the appreciation of history that has already been had. These things are traps as much as they are descriptive aspects of our personality. So when we look at these two, the social and historical clock, social clock is culture-based. It's what you should be doing, family expectations, and it creates the generation gap. The history clock is experience-based. Critical identity, the deep aspects of our personal identity come from the generation that we belong to. Technology plays a huge role. That's one of the ways, the measuring tape we can use to describe different points in history. And of course, contributes to the generation gap. So when we look at the different generations, the ones that we've been able to document, I talked about boomers, I talked about Gen X. Let's take a look. There's some basic generalizations that we can make about these. Now, generalizations are always problematic. So I'm not saying that anybody born in a particular time of history is going to guaranteed be like this. Just general trends that we tend to see. These are big numbers. They can't be applied to any individual. You have to get to know that individual. But it does give you an appreciation that there are differences based on the historical clock. And this is where we get those names when we talk about the traditionalist 1900 to 1945. This constitutes actually two generations. The greatest generation and the silent generation. The greatest generation, people went for World War II, born in the Depression, World War II. And then there's a silent generation. Right at the beginning of the baby boomers. The baby boomers were born 1946 to 1964. Gen X, you can see I'm in 1965. Millennials, born from 1977 to 1997. And then Gen Z. And Gen Z, born after 1997, and now we're really looking into Gen Y, the young kids that are coming in. And you can see this is aged. This is all based in 2020. So you have traditionalists have gone through the Great Depression, World War II. They're disciplined, workplace loyalty, moved to the suburbs, and they were the first ones to really get into vaccines. That's when vaccines, just to put that particular topic out there. The boomers saw Vietnam, the moon landing, civil rights, experimental. They're innovators, hardworking, invented the personal computer. Gen X came along. We saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Gulf War, very independent, free agents as far as work is concerned. We had MTV, the AIDS epidemic, and the mobile phone came in. Millennials come in and they're aware of the 9/11 attacks, the change that had on our world. Community service, immediacy, wanting things right away in terms, and that comes from technology as well. Confident, very into diversity, social everything, Google and Facebook. And then this Gen Y, or this newest generation, age 15 and younger in 2020, optimistic, high expectations, apps, social games, and tablets. But you can see these individuals can talk, but they use different language and they come from different places. This work largely comes from organizations that have multiple generations working for them. So if you're a manager and you have people from in your workforce all from all over the map here, in order for those individuals to come together as a team and be productive, it's really important for them to be able to understand each other from the perspective that they're coming from their particular generation. The one theory I want to introduce you in a multiplicity of developmental theories is one that is near and dear to me, a very big part of my own work, and that is the work of Erickson. Now, Erickson was a student of Freud, and while Freud can be considered the father of developmental psych, he introduced the first stage theory that was popular, identifying those initial stages right up until adolescence, and then he thought things were pretty much done after that. His student, Erickson, himself, an individual very closely tied to the process of identity development, felt that that was not only the end, but in Freud's theory, the focus was the psyche and the energy that would eventually, that is connected to the procreation instinct. So it was sexual. Although there's misunderstandings about what he felt was sexual in infants, what he talked about was the energy that would then eventually develop into sexual energy. But either way, he called it the psychosocial stages of development as we moved from one erogenous zone to the next. So we have those terms that come out where there's oral, phallic, anal, these were areas of the body that became the focal points of the relationship between the individual and the surroundings around them. Erickson said that the other force that we're dealing with is not necessarily sexual, although he concurred that those things were important. He said that the emerging psyche is encountering, for good or for worse, the social world. So from Erickson, we move from psychosexual to the phrase he termed psychosocial. Now we hear that all the time, even outside the context of Erickson's theory. But what we're looking at is the emerging psyche, what we're ready to do. This is very much psychological clock. But then there's the social clock coming along and either promoting or inhibiting our development in one way or the other. So Erickson portrays all of his stages as dichotomies that talk about what is the task of the developing human in a society during a particular age. So it has deep connections to the psychological and the social clock. So here's Erickson, and here's his theory. We'll take a closer look at that and look at each one of these stages. The first one identifies a stage that we call infancy, and this is trust versus mistrust, basic trust and basic mistrust. Is the world going to respond to my crying, hunger, wetness, coldness? And if so, that's great. If not, I'll lean toward the mistrust. Now, one thing that Erickson did identify in all of these stages as we go through, the earlier if we start out good, we have a tendency to stay good. So the more good produces more good. Start bad, starts going worse. So he, like Freud, felt that these first few stages were very foundational. If things went pretty good, we managed through the first few stages, we're probably going to do all right. If not, we might be in trouble. The next stage comes autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is the children. These are terrible twos. They want to do things all on their own. We have to make sure that we don't shame them when they make mistakes and allow them as much autonomy as is safe. And then related to that, we're looking at preschool initiative versus guilt. Very much like autonomy. Autonomy, however, is self-expression in terms of doing things by their own. Initiatives when they come up with ideas. So, for example, the 2-year-old insists on tying their own shoes as a expression of autonomy. The 3-year-old might get it into their head they're going to cook breakfast for you, and they're downstairs starting the fire. So that's kind of might see where you see that. Then they go into school, and what you see in this dichotomy is industry, what they're good at, and then comparison. They're not only what they're good at, but how good are they at it compared to others. And we see the enter of the school coming in, where to some degree we're compared. I mean, compared to your siblings, compared to your playmates, but schools make it official. They have grades, they have achievements, they put stars up on the charts. It's that first kind of like, how are you in comparison to your peers, and how important that is. It's very, very, so these first 4 stages, trust, autonomy, initiative, and industry, set the stage for the initiation of a sense of self, and we get into identity in the 5th stage. And see, the other one is role confusion. Maybe I haven't learned enough at this point to really establish my own identity. Now, I want to make a very, very clear point here about the next stage. Here we have adolescence that has to do with identity, and then you have young adulthood that has to do with intimacy. Now, in Erickson's model, we probably should know a lot about ourselves before we try to connect with somebody else. But the reality is we often learn about ourselves through the process of connecting with others. So these 2 stages intermingle. We don't wait till we're a young adult to engage in intimate relationships and friendships and possibly even romantic relationships. And we're not done identity by that time. But the balance between knowing yourself and being able to be a good partner in a relationship is expressed within this theory. So it's important, maybe before you make commitments, that you understand yourself enough at the identity level that you can be in a healthy, intimate relationship. So we go on to that. Then on to middle adulthood. This is the largest stage. This is when you're doing your life stuff. What are you going to be doing? Your job, your work, everything. And that's generation versus stagnation. Sometimes this is equated to midlife events and crises. Now, midlife events are when we kind of we come to a point in our life and we're like, okay, I'm getting older. I can feel that. There's more behind me than there is left in my life. Maybe I need to take stock. Do I need to make any changes? And that's the midlife event, and it could happen at other ages too. But midlife sort of biology catches up with you, and you say, okay, is everything going the way I want it, or do I need to make changes? Because if I'm going to make changes, I got to do them now. closely related to the biological clock. Sometimes in terms of women having children, they might say, I got it, it's now or never. And that can be a stressful time if they're not connected with somebody, if they've been doing something else. Or you might get to that event, that midlife event, and say, all set, set the path, I'm good as it is. If not, you might go into the process of looking around at what the options are. And I'll just give a teaser, in my developmental psych class, I go into a lot of the minutia of that process. When we're looking at options to make changes, that's actually one psychologist's definition of crisis. So the midlife crisis is not, it can be, but it's not frantic, it's not out of control. It could be okay, I want to make some changes. I'm going to start making some changes because I only have so much time left. Now, that is an anticipation, of course, of the later stage, maturity, ego integrity versus despair, which is at that point in our life where we're starting to look back. Pretty hard to find an elderly person who doesn't like to look back and tell stories from way back then. But they're looking back and they're weaving together the fabric of their lives. Did I do a good job? Did I make the most out of my life? Am I happy with the results? That's ego integrity. The despair is the recognition that if you haven't done that, then it's basically too late to make changes now. Not a place that you want to be in. As a social worker, I've encountered people who were dying in despair, and it was not pretty. So part of what I teach, particularly in this class and in developmental psych, is to be aware of these stages and how important it is for you to make best efforts, particularly as an adult, where we're still developing our identity, we're still developing intimacy, and we're still developing our generativity. KVCC is a great place for people where I work. It's a great place for people to come to who are going through some of these changes. I used to call it, the midlife Mecca, or maybe it's a quarter life Mecca, or you went out and tried working, and now you're coming back, or maybe your kids are now left and it's time for you to come and do your thing. And that's a very powerful audience. And so it's an interesting place to work when those are the motivations to achieve aspects of Erickson's theory, and thus, predictably, leave this world with ego integrity. So it's a big thing for me in terms of looking at this, and it's a wonderful theory for describing the processes in almost anything. When you go to a new job, you go through processes of trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, your identity, your connection, emotional connection, and then getting the work done. You can almost trace any sort of transition that you go into this kind of cycle of how that becomes part of who you are. So it's a very cool theory. So that's it for lifespan development. Hopefully at some point I'll be doing some videos for developmental psych. I know that I've done videos on Erickson's theory itself in my Dr. K's Psychobabble video, so that's something to look at too. And that's it until next time when we take on the next chapter. So have a great day.